The Ford Everest was launched in South Africa in 2015, and with it came a genuine alternative to what a lot of South Africans saw as the unimpeachable Toyota Fortuner. But as good as it was back then, there were a few concerns. One, the model range was very limited, and two, it was expensive. Originally built in Thailand, the Everest lineup started out with a choice of just 2 models. With production now switched to South Africa, the range has expanded to 8 and includes options like this one, the 2.2-litre manual 4x4 in XLS spec. It retains a lot of what makes the Everest such a good package, including strong looks and a comfortable interior. And at 537,000 Rand, it's relatively more affordable. And that's not even the cheapest one. You could get the same motor and the same interior spec for 80 grand less. Of course, that means you'll have to do without the other thing that makes this car so good, its off-road ability. Our test car, though, is fitted with permanent all-wheel drive with low range, as well as Ford's system for selecting various off-road driving modes. And we've got enough experience of the Everest to know that it really is quite good in the dirt. We drove the 3.2-litre Auto on its launch and gave it a few chances then for it to show off its rough road abilities. We also drove its cousin, the Ranger, with a similar drivetrain to the Everest we're testing here, in some pretty testing dunes last year. Everest or Ranger, it seems that Ford's off-road machines never seem to struggle, coming out on top no matter what we throw at them. This configuration, though, with its 6-speed manual gearbox should be better than the automatic, because quite simply it allows you to rely on your own skill rather than a bunch of computer chips. But I do have some concerns. The 2.2-litre motor puts out 118 kilowatts and 385 newton meters, whether it's in the Everest or the Ranger, which we drove a few months ago. But the Everest weighs around 250 kilograms more, and there's been no adjustment for the extra weight. So the torque and the power peaks are the same, but it just doesn't feel as good. It's like that extra weight, which is about 10% worth, is just too much for the drivetrain to handle. So that means there's no real bottom-end power. There's also no real top-end power either. What you get instead is a steady but unimpressive and sometimes quite labored forward movement. It's common practice in a diesel, especially a bucky or SUV, to short shift from first to second because there's usually more than enough power at the bottom end of the rev range. But doing that in here is an absolute no-no, as is shifting too early from second into third, which has the same result: a foot full of accelerator and not much in the way of actual acceleration. That isn't good news for towing or serious off-roading. But there are more everyday concerns. The only real way to get over that power deficit is to keep the revs up with every gear change. And the problem with that is, well, it's quite obvious. The higher your revs are on average, the worse your fuel consumption is going to be. We had the Everest in a decent mix of highway and city driving, and the best figure we saw was 10 litres per 100 Ks, quite far from Ford's claim of 7.1. But it's not all a dead loss. Once you're on the move, the Everest is actually pretty easy to handle. Nicely weighted steering for a big car and an easy enough gear shift that you have to use quite regularly thanks to the power situation, and a comfortable interior setup. There are quite a lot of buttons though, and still quite a bit of plastic to remind you of its lower spec status, although it is a spec that packs everyday usability and comfort, including good materials and a solid build. In terms of toys, there's Bluetooth and USB, a multifunction steering wheel with cruise control. It's also got independent front and rear aircon, and to make getting the big car into tight spots a little easier, a rear view camera. The 7 seats are standard, and happily, there is a usable portion of boot space even with the third row in place. And despite its woes, it's still a great looking car. The new Fortuner is much better looking than the old one, but it's still somehow not as purposeful as the Everest, which seems to carry with it a bit more attitude. And the entry-level spec does nothing to take away from the Everest style. The Ford Everest 2.2 diesel occupies its own space in the marketplace. The nearest option from its toughest competitor, the Fortuner, costs 60,000 Rand more. But the Everest is underwhelming from an everyday enjoyment and a power delivery point of view, so even though you save yourself a bit of money, you definitely feel what you're missing out on. The 2.2-litre diesel has decent figures on paper, but loses out in the real world because of a lack of power in most driving situations. While the Everest is a good performer off-road and has good on-road manners, it can be frustrating because of the engine. It still packs superb looks and a comfortable, well-kitted cabin, and if you don't mind the subpar performance, it offers good value.